welcome. I also want to thank your wonderful staff, which was really helpful, and our Fels staff, John Lipinski and Lauren Russell, who are our directors here as well. And of course, our Masters in Public Administration students and the Broader Penn in Philadelphia fan club, which is on this Zoom. A couple of housekeeping things before we start. We have 2 sign language interpreters with us. Feel free to pin them to your screen or enable the captions feature if you'd like. I will be asking the first half of the questions as usual, and you audience will ask the remaining. If you have a question, please put it in the chat with your name and affiliation there. Mindy Zachris will manage these and will ask the questions in the second half. I also want to note that because of the Hatch Act, a reminder that the secretary cannot answer purely political questions, i.e. he cannot comment on the campaign. Otherwise, I think we have a green light. So let me introduce you. Secretary Buttigieg, as you know, I think everyone has the bio, but briefly, he was sworn in 2021 as our 19th Secretary of Transportation, working, as he will talk about, to build a world-leading transportation system with 5 or so particular focuses, as we will talk about. You were instrumental in the passage and now the delivery of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which I believe was the largest since the Eisenhower Interstate Highway Act in the 50s. So a huge achievement. I know you'll talk about it, but I believe it's $1.2 trillion and a zillion projects, 40,000 or something. Secretary Buttigieg served 2 terms as mayor of his hometown, South Bend, Indiana. Also worked across the aisle, and then 7 years as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve in a deployment to Afghanistan in 2014. Ran for president in 2020, won the Iowa caucus, which was exciting, and came second in New Hampshire and later endorsed Biden. Went to Harvard and Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Lives with his husband, Chasten, your 2 children, Gus and Penelope, and your dog. What is your dog's name? I need to know that.
That would be Buddy.
Buddy, okay. Dog important in my life too. So welcome.
Thank you.
And my first question is usually and always, and people love to know this actually, is who or what inspired you as a young person in your family or elsewhere to pursue this public service? And how did growing up in the Midwest shape your values? And can you hang on to them in Washington?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's really a treat to be back with you. It meant a great deal to me to have the opportunity to speak at Fels in person some years ago, and I've really been looking forward to this discussion as well. So it's a treat. To answer your question, I really think most of my pull toward public service came from the household I grew up in, and it was not a politically connected household by any means. I don't remember meeting any elected officials growing up, but it was a very politically conscious household. And my parents would always be, it was the kind of family where somebody was always yelling at the TV, whatever was on the evening news, my parents would feel very passionately about. And we would talk about it at dinner and talk about decisions that were being made, decisions that should have been made differently in their view. And yet, I think most of the time I was growing up, and most of that time I wanted to be an airline pilot. I viewed the people who were involved in those decisions as just belonging to a different class or category than I did. Until I had a chance as a high schooler to start participating in some programming that gave students a chance to visit Washington. I for career day, halfway as a joke, put down mayor. And the then mayor of South Bend invited me to shadow him for a day and see what the job was all about. And then when I got to college, I had the opportunity to be in programs like this one, where speakers who were cabinet secretaries and senators and governors would come speak on campus, and began to realize that while those people might be deeply experienced or in some way much more deep on an issue than I was. They might be more experienced than I was or more intelligent than I was, but they were not on a different plane of existence. They were just people. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I realized that, I began to realize that I could be involved in a different way in public service. I still didn't know that it would mean the path that I wound up on. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that really prompted me to get into elected public service was events. So I was motivated to run for state treasurer of Indiana, first office I ever ran for, because I saw the then state treasurer intervening to try to prevent Chrysler from being rescued, which was a huge issue for us in Indiana because I grew up in the shadows, really in the wreckage of car factories that had gone dark in the 1960s. And I knew that if our state treasurer in Indiana got his way, the same thing would happen to Chrysler factories in places like Kokomo, Indiana. And thousands of families would experience that devastation. So I decided to challenge him, which it turns out there's not a lot of competition for who got to do that because not a lot of people were itching to run statewide as a Democrat in Indiana in 2010 for an office that nobody had heard of. A lot of people don't, nobody sits on their mother's knee growing up and says that they want to grow up and be state treasurer. And so the party pretty much let me have it in terms of the nomination. They were just, I think, appreciative that somebody was willing to do it. But I spent that next year campaigning. I got clobbered. I didn't come anywhere close to winning, but I learned how campaigning works. And I got to know the people involved at the grassroots in my state. And then when our longest serving mayor in history, the same one who had invited high school students to shadow him in his day at work years earlier, said he wasn't going to run again, I started talking to people who I had been talking to for years anyway about how a younger generation might take our city in a new direction, and began to realize it was time for me to make myself useful in that way. And obviously a lot of things came after that. As far as being Midwestern, I didn't realize how Midwestern I was until I left. Growing up in a place like South Bend, Indiana, with all those crumbling car factories, I took on board an unwritten, unspoken message that success had to do with getting out. So that's what I did. But the moment I got to New England to study at Harvard, I began to realize that I was from somewhere. I began to realize that largely because I would say hi to passersby in the street and they would look at me funny. I began to realize that I was actually the product of a culture. The very same place that I had felt a little bit in tension with growing up. There were many reasons why I didn't feel completely at home in my hometown. Began to be things that I sometimes owned and made me feel like I stood out at a place like Harvard. And that was when I began to realize that I would need to find my way home, which I gradually did in my early professional life until I was back in South Bend. And then, as I said, running for office.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I want to say, by the way, most of the people on this call want to be you in their next life. They're mostly about 25 years old, which is about how old you were when, well, actually, that's older than you were when you got involved. So thank you for being so inspiring to the group right here. So it sounds to me like you believe in running for local office and getting your feet wet, and of course losing and getting up again. So that's also extremely inspiring. I assume your role as mayor prepared you in great ways for the national stage.
Very much so. Matter of fact, even to this day, in my 4th year as a cabinet secretary, when I'm giving a speech or visiting a community or making a decision, I find that I think at least as much as a former mayor as I do as anything else, including as a cabinet secretary. It is the most formative experience, certainly, of my public life, closely followed by my experience in the military. One thing I would say about it is that, it turns out politics, policy, public office, it's many things. But one of the things it is a craft. And you practice that craft in whatever venue you get a chance to do it in. For many young people, maybe the target audience you're describing, often it's as an organizer in the campaign world. But the reason I say that's so important is because some of the things you do, they're different as the scale increases, but they're not that different. So, for example, I knew it was very important to speak to the community as often as I could, and that television was an important tool to do that. And so every week, I would go to a different TV studio in one of the 4 TV stations in South Bend, Indiana, sit down with the anchor for whatever they wanted to talk about, and have an interview and get my message out. And through that, also understand what the newsroom considered to be important. The number of people watching, if I go on, I don't know, ABC This Week, like I did on Sunday, or Fox News, like I also might be 1,000 times more than the number of people watching when I sat down at WSBT to do an interview with a local anchor. But if you think about it, the experience isn't that different. You're
Mm-hmm.
coming through the door, you're sitting at a desk, there's a couple of cameras, there's an anchor, it's
Mm-hmm.
8 minutes, right? As a craft, it's
Mm-hmm.
not different. And so the fact that I had done hundreds, maybe thousands of interviews,
Mm-hmm.
even though they were all at the local level,
Mm-hmm.
meant that I felt very familiar with the at least the mechanics of what I
Mm-hmm.
when I was
Mm-hmm.
giving interviews at the national level, when I was running for president.
Mm-hmm.
And whether we're talking about giving an interview or making a complicated policy decision,
Mm-hmm.
in many ways, whatever you learn doing it at whatever level you do it at
Mm-hmm.
gives you the terms to then practice it at a different level too.
Mm-hmm. Wow, beautiful answer. Well, segue from that, really, I was watching you yesterday, which I do whenever I can, because you truly are the most eloquent spokesperson, or one of the most, absolutely most eloquent for this administration, and thank God you exist for that reason and others. But yesterday I was watching, and you were talking about the infrastructure act, I should say, and I thought, many people glaze over when you talk about infrastructure, roads and bridges. They're not terribly sexy or glamorous. But you made a really interesting link from the infrastructure strategies to our democracy versus autocracy. I'd love it if you'd mention that. And also, this is a big question. Can you tell us what the Infrastructure Act will do? Because your predecessors couldn't get it done, and how it's going almost 2 years after.
Yeah, so the Infrastructure Act is obviously something I'm hugely proud of and that we work hard on every day now to deliver. And what it basically consists of is $1.2 trillion in funding, the most since at least the Eisenhower administration in real terms, or in nominal terms, to improve and transform American infrastructure. About half of that 1.2 trillion is transportation. The other half is things like getting rid of lead pipes, which the EPA is leading, getting broadband out to every household in the country, which my colleague Gina Raimondo is leading at the Department of Commerce, getting our grid upgraded, which Secretary Granholm and the Department of Energy are leading, and other projects that are different kinds of infrastructure. But the transportation half, that 600 billion or so, sits with us. And that means roads, bridges, ports, airports, trains, transit, even pipelines, to some extent, making natural gas pipelines safer in small communities so they don't leak methane. All of that is part of this. Some of it moves through dollars that go out to the states. As a matter of fact, most of it does. Others are discretionary grants, which means a team in this building puts together recommendations, and then at the end of the day, I sign a list of the handful of projects that competed that we're able to do. And just to take it a bit close to home, for where you all are, as an example, yesterday I spent part of my day in Philadelphia celebrating or checking in on really the MLK Bridge, which leads into just behind the Art Museum.
Mm-hmm.
$20 million there out of the Bridge Formula program. So that's an example of dollars that wouldn't have happened without without the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm.
But they were programmed by Josh Shapiro's administration or maybe Governor Wolf too, in Pennsylvania, going through that state formula process. Today, the president is announcing the Reconnecting Communities Awards, which includes a major grant, about $150 million, also headed to Philadelphia to connect Chinatown, where the Vine
Wonderful.
Street Expressway, in a really egregious historical example of how highways sometimes divided the very communities that they were supposed to be connecting, in a way people live with to this day, is now going to be capped over, creating new green space, new land, and a new level of connectivity for people in Chinatown. So those are just two examples of work that we're able to do. And these projects have been often envisioned for a long time. They just never got done because there wasn't funding. To get to the other part of your question, the reason I think very workaday, some would even say pedestrian, no pun intended, projects, whether it's a multi-use trail or an upgrade to the berth capacity of the Port of Miami. The reason all of that, I think, has to do with really cosmic things that we're talking about as a country like now, like the durability of our democracy. The reason is that so much of the legitimacy of any form of government rests on how it does in delivering the basics. I think that a classic transportation example comes from the fact that when it was last considered fashionable in some American circles to talk approvingly of fascism in the 1930s, The excuse that was made for Mussolini was that he supposedly made the trains run on time. By the way, that's not true. But that's what people would say. Maybe, okay, yeah, he's a tough guy. Yeah, maybe it's a dictatorship, but they get things done. So it's very important for us to prove otherwise. It's very important for the legitimacy of democracy for us to demonstrate that a democratic system, messy though it might be, is better equipped to deliver on everyday life than the alternatives. I think that's part of how we won the Cold War. As much as our military might, it was that the US delivered a better everyday life. And by the way, that's part of how things went the wrong way in Afghanistan. And I remember being there with a mayor's eye view, because I had already been mayor when I was deployed as a reservist and put away my mayoral role and put on my uniform as a lieutenant and spent about half a year there, mostly driving my commander around the city of Kabul. And I saw firsthand what it's like if you're in a city that doesn't have good trash pickup, doesn't have animal control, and has packs of wild dogs running around, doesn't have those basic services. And part of how the Taliban sought to build its legitimacy was to compete over who was better at providing basic services. So these very concrete, again, no pun intended, workaday things wind up actually having colossal stakes. And President Biden's very attuned to that as well, as we see other models, notably the model of China, being held up and compared to ours, sometimes in a way that implies that ours is just too messy to get big things done.
Oh, beautiful. I love that link, and it hadn't occurred to me. And I'm glad that you're communicating it, because it's fascinating and powerful. So the other thing on the Infrastructure Act, obviously, well, not obviously, it was a beautiful example of bipartisan work across the aisle. I wonder if you have figured out the recipe so you can duplicate it or replicate it in other areas, or are we so far apart now that this will prove to be an exception?
Well, I can't claim any magic spells when it comes to bipartisanship, but I will say that I think this package shows that it can be done. And by the way, now we've already gotten so used to this infrastructure package that I think it's hard for people to imagine that it could have been otherwise. Could have been otherwise. As a matter of fact, the obituary of this legislation was written many times in 2021 while President Biden was trying to get it done. I remember with having my infant daughter in one arm and a cell phone in the other, frantically calling members of Congress on the eve of one of the votes, trying to make sure that we shored up the support that we needed. And I think it was specifically vindicating President Biden's account of how this could get done, that it was done on a bipartisan basis. Look, not everything we've done is bipartisan. Even some of the things we're doing with 70% support among the American people, like capping the cost of insulin at $35 a month for seniors, had to be done on a party line vote. The Inflation Reduction Act, even though it's bringing massive investments to rural and Republican areas just as much as it does more Democratic areas, had to be delivered on a party line vote. But at the Chips and Science Act, where people like Todd Young from my native Indiana, from the Republican Party, worked across the aisle to get things done. And certainly the infrastructure bill, where we sat in meeting after meeting, session after session. The president invited, I was there when we had Republican and Democratic senators and House members in the Oval Office as the president sketched out the four corners of where we might be able to find a deal space. I learned to use deal space as a noun, and we found it.
Yeah.
I think the lesson in that is when important things stand to get done that people believe in, there's always at least a fighting chance that you can bipartisan level.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations. It's huge, and we're all benefiting, the whole country. So again, leveraging off your tremendous ability to communicate, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the powerful recovery of the U.S. economy and the weaker than expected public reception of this. If you could review the economic progress of the last 3 years, also the job creation you expect from the new infrastructure projects, and how are we going to communicate this better?
Let me share what's going on economically, and then I'll share why I think it hasn't been enough for America to feel satisfied. First of all, the proportions of it are incredible, and it would be easy to overlook the before and after picture. When we got here, the economy was, as the president sometimes says, flat on its back. Take one subset of the transportation sector as an example. Today, the big problem with airlines is with extraordinary growth in demand, can they continue to conveniently and safely serve all of the customers who are buying airline tickets right now? Just 3 years ago, when we got here, the big question about our airlines was, are they all going out to go out of business? And how quickly are they going to go out of business? And can we somehow stop that? Similarly in shipping, when, in 2021, by September, the media was asking if Christmas was going to be canceled because our supply chains were so congested as a result of the upheaval of COVID. But by that Christmas, actually what we experienced was an all-time record high in terms of goods throughput at our ports and retail sales in our stores. So those are just a couple examples out of the transportation sector. More generally, what we're seeing is unemployment that has never been this low for this long, certainly in my lifetime. I remember trying to just get unemployment out of the double digits when I took office in South Bend, and now it's been below 4% for an extraordinarily long time. We had a tough bout with inflation, and it's important to acknowledge how much pain that caused in family budgets. It's also important to see how much inflation has come down. It's back in the 3 to 4% territory. And a lot of that, by the way, because of supply chain work and other steps that reduced the upward pressure on prices. And it's very rare to have unemployment low and inflation low at the same time. In fact, it was widely believed that the only way to fight inflation would be to take steps that would trigger a recession. Almost everybody thought we'd be in a recession by now, and we're not. Job creation. Most jobs created under any president ever. Manufacturing jobs, especially important to me and to the industrial Midwest. Construction jobs. Wages going up faster than prices. All of this is happening. We got to talk about. But we also have to make sure that we connect the dots on how we got here. When you get that $35 a month insulin, the pharmacist doesn't hand you a flyer saying, by the way, this is because of the Biden administration. He doesn't say, here's your Biden-Harris $35 insulin. When you're getting hearing aids over the counter now, something else that has taken the squeeze off of a lot of families and seniors' budgets, the box that the hearing aid doesn't come in, that comes in doesn't say, this is happening because of a decision that was made in Washington. Yeah. There are signs going up along some of the projects that we're doing around the country. I saw one in Philadelphia specifying that these projects were brought to you by the bipartisan infrastructure law, but even those take a while to get underway, and they certainly take a while to complete. Anybody who's been in a relationship or a marriage knows that you don't go into a conversation with someone you're in a relationship with saying, you're wrong to feel the way you feel. You shouldn't feel this way. You should feel a different way. That's not going to get you anywhere. And that's the last thing that we should be doing in communicating with people who do still feel pain from prices being elevated, whose expectations and possibilities have changed because interest rates are higher than they were a few years ago. Or who are simply recovering from the generational trauma of COVID, which after all, it was 4 years ago today that emergency was declared. And 4 years is not a very long time to bounce back from a generational trauma that kills 1 million people and shuts down your society. There's lots of things that have people feeling sour, many of which have to do with our economy.
Yeah.
We can't deny that. We shouldn't try. But what we need to do is talk about the most important thing of all, which isn't what we've done, although we're proud of what we've done, is what we're doing next. It's about the fact that the president's agenda of getting $35 insulin caps for seniors includes getting that for every American, senior or not. And if a few congressional Republicans would join him, we could do it tomorrow. That he has an agenda of raising the minimum wage, which is one of the best things we can do to make sure wages for everybody rise faster than prices. A fairer tax code. These are things that he's proposing to do next that most Americans believe in. And that really illustrate, I think, the most important contrast, which is over different economic visions competing for dominance in today's official Washington. And that's, I think, the most important part of how we talk about the economy. As proud as we are of what we've done, we got to name check it and then move on quickly to what we're about to do, if given the chance.
Oh, great answer and great strategy. So related to that in my mind, I've heard you talk about, well, I know that you were unbelievably young and had real criticism that you had to navigate about your age. I think you were 28 when you were mayor. Is that about right? which is incredible and a testament to you. But I know you had criticism of that for obvious reason. Have you actually done anything? How old are you? And I've heard you draw parallels to the age of someone else involved today in your administration. I wonder if you could just briefly mention that. Good sort of parallel. It was quite interesting about the future versus, yeah.
Yeah, I think President Biden's best response on the question of his age is not that different from the best response available to me when my age was questioned for a very different reason when I was a young mayor. And it's that the most important thing any of us has to offer in public life is results. And we're asking to be judged on those results. And as a citizen, I think a lot more about what a leader will deliver or has delivered than I do about how old they are, or for that matter, their ethnicity or race or orientation or anything else. What matters most is what they have to offer and what they've done. And that's, I got my community to agree and to judge me based on what we had delivered for the city and how the city's trajectory changed. And I believe President Biden's leadership is part of why the United States trajectory has changed for the better.
Yeah.
And people can argue all day whether that's in spite of his age or because of his age experience. But either way, it's happening.
Yeah. Well, the proof is in the pudding. I happen to like pudding, and I just love that analogy. Just look at what we've done and what we are proposing. So that's I love that analogy to age, your age. Okay, my last question before the audience questions. Theirs are always better, by the way, than mine. I know you focus, of course, principally in your job on domestic issues, but you did serve in our most recent war, Afghanistan. I wonder if you have any thoughts, and this is a tough question or a big one, from your experience on our most effective role in trying to solve the two current wars. I know that's like 2 PhD theses. And how do we contain Putin? How do we deal with Gaza without getting directly involved? Do you have any thoughts from when you were there?
Well, I don't claim to have any insights beyond what others in the administration or even in this call would have. I would say that I think anyone who has seen war up close knows that what is most important is the suffering that it creates, and therefore, what is most important is to end that suffering. The president has an approach to try to use the diplomatic tools of the United States to bring an end to the suffering in Gaza. And make sure that Israeli hostages and Palestinian civilians are protected and are safe in the future. In the case of Ukraine, which I visited in November and had the opportunity to sit down with President Zelensky, and I'm in frequent touch with my counterpart there. I think the most important thing is for the United States to recognize that supporting Ukraine is not some charitable cause. It is enlightened self-interest, and indeed one of the most frankly, cost-effective ways in treasure and in blood to keep Western democracies, including our own, safe from aggression. And I think that is a bipartisan consensus among the American people. I think deep down, there's even a bipartisan majority for that in Congress. We just haven't gotten that to turn into a vote. I hope we do, because it's very important to me, the time I look my counterpart in the eye, to be able to continue saying that we can deliver on America's commitments to stand by our allies.
Well, and we theoretically believe in representative government, and as you say, 70% agree. Let's go. And I see yesterday there was some move in that direction, so that there was some contribution. Great. Well, thank you so much from me, and we're going to turn to Mindy now and have some questions from the field.
Thank you so much, Secretary Buttigieg and Elizabeth, for the wonderful conversation. We've got tons of great questions coming in. I'm going to do some combining to get it to as many as we can. So first kind of group of questions about public transportation. Maybe a quick fun question. What is the most unexpected or interesting encounter you've had while using public transportation? And then kind of along the theme of public transportation, how can we better communicate? How can public officials better communicate messages around risk to the general public? You had commented over the weekend that flying is the safest in the world, but might not feel as that way to the average person. How can we communicate about public transportation better?
Well, I believe passionately in the power of public transportation to solve so many issues from housing, because housing affordability is often inseparable from whether you have transportation from affordable housing to a good paying job, and whether that transportation is itself affordable. It's an important part of the solution to climate. As excited as we are about EVs, the more we can give people excellent alternatives to having to be behind the wheel of a vehicle at all, the more we are saving them time, money, and reducing pollution. Public transit even benefits the people who don't use it, because it means there's less congestion on the roads for the people who do use those roads. And so we see how much benefit it has. And I love taking transit too. It's the logistics of moving cabinet members around were a headwind early on, but I remember after being talked out of just hopping the metro here any number of times, being on my way to APTA, the American Public Transit Association meeting, and saying, I am not going to be driven to the APTA meeting right next to a metro stop when my office is also right next to a metro stop. We're going to take the metro. And I frequently take the metro with our children, which has given me a whole new set of experiences. Many of them good, seeing through the wonder of their eyes, but also some of them eye-opening in a more troubling way. Because if you have never used a wheelchair to navigate a subway system, and you want to get just some inkling of what it's like for those who do, pushing a stroller and having to rely on the elevator system and the more accessible infrastructure is a pretty quick crash course in what that can be like. And it's one of the reasons why part of the infrastructure package is a program called ASAP, where we are funding accessibility improvements in older transit systems that were built pre-ADA and still are not properly accessible. And that was led by Senator Duckworth, for whom this is very personal as well. And we're proud of the work that we're doing there. So we've had lots of great experiences, but so many experiences, good, bad, and indifferent on public transit. Maybe the most surprising one I had was back when I was mayor, where on principle, I would sometimes ride our bus, even though I was almost within walking distance to the office from where I lived. And asked the person sitting next to me about his commute, and he explained that it was taking him about 2 hours to get to where he was going. As you know, South Bend is not a particularly big city, but it was because the service was so infrequent and depended on this hub and spoke model that was so outdated. That it took him easily an hour and a half more to get to work than it would if he had a car. And to me, that was a call for us to innovate, especially in the era of ride sharing, micro mobility, scooters, Lime bikes, all of these things, to be a little more creative about what transit looks like. And some of the best transit agencies I see are marrying traditional hub and spoke systems and 40-foot bus systems with innovative systems for rides on demand, and working in a handshake fashion where it's not rideshare versus transit. It's making sure they reinforce each other. To the other question about risk, we do have very particular psychology as human beings about risk. For example, we are unfortunately much more ready to tolerate loss of life as a result of a mistake by a human driver than we are if it seems like that happened because of the technology. We need to accelerate the development of technologies that are safer than human drivers, and also hold them to the highest standards so that they can earn public acceptance from people who are leery of stepping into vehicles with a lot of technology. But let's be clear, the track record of human drivers is murderous. 40,000 people a year are killed in roadway crashes. That is as many people as can fill a 737 getting killed every single day. By the way, that's one of the reasons why we're funding improvements to Roosevelt Boulevard in Philadelphia, because roadway design is part of roadway safety. With aviation, since this administration arrived, approximately 3 billion passenger enplanements have occurred and 0 crash fatalities. Our job is to keep it that way. Well, industry's job, the sector's job, everybody's job is to do their part to try to keep it that way. It is an extraordinary civilizational accomplishment that a form of transportation that involves being propelled through the air by flammable liquids at almost the speed of sound, thousands of feet above the surface of the ground, is the safest way to move from one place to another in the United States of America. That happens because of extremely rigorous maintenance, monitoring, regulation. And when anything does happen that even could have turned into a fatal crash, an extremely intense period of assessing what happened there, which is why there is so much scrutiny rightly being applied by my department and others toward Boeing, which needs to demonstrate that they can show the highest possible level of quality control and safety before we will allow them to increase their production of aircraft, because we rightly have high expectations for aviation. So we have to maintain a strong record in aviation safety and get other fields like roadway safety to start thinking about risk in ways that are closer to how we think about the safety of our planes.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to try to shout out the students, the wonderful Fels Institute of Government students who are asking these questions. So that one was in part from Avneet Najjar, who's part of our class of 24, and a number of others. I've gotten a number of questions about the infrastructure bill and climate. So to what extent are funding for the infrastructure bill being used to perpetuate for infrastructure that perpetuates fossil fuel versus sustainable infrastructure? What is being done to think about carbon emissions, and how can we be more conscious of our environmental choices? And those are from Heather Corzin, and Rachel Griffin, and a number of other wonderful students and alumni.
Well, the two are inseparable. In our economy, transportation is the sector that contributes the most greenhouse gas emissions, which means to me, we have to aspire in transportation to be the biggest part of the solution. And this is a constant theme, both of our policy work domestically and of our international engagements, including being very high on the agenda when I met with my counterparts at the G7 ministerial in Japan last year. In fact, I would argue that if the Inflation Reduction Act was the biggest climate legislation ever passed in the United States, which it was, I would argue the second biggest climate legislation ever passed is actually the infrastructure bill. And the reason I say that is it contains the biggest investment in federal history for transit, and getting more opportunities for transit is one of the best things we can do to cut emissions. It includes funding to buy zero-emission buses for transit authorities around the country. The opportunity to electrify our vehicles, which you are working very aggressively to support, making it more affordable and making it easier to charge. Because all of these things and more, from sustainable aviation fuel to electrifying our ports, will be part of how we meet our very ambitious goals of decarbonizing transportation by the middle of this century. It's also something we have to do with our eyes open about the distance between here and there. And that means recognizing that today, the majority of our transportation systems are dependent on fossil fuels. That doesn't change overnight. So we also have to deal with the infrastructure for those means of transportation as we have them now, and make sure they don't become unsafe, even if we're in the middle of a big transition where they will become less necessary for the future. That's why we're doing things like investing in repairing natural gas pipelines in communities that might be working towards solar. But if it's going to take them 10, 20, 30 years to get to the renewable mix they aspire to be, we can't afford to have 10, 20, or 30 years of dirty and unsafe conditions in the infrastructure that gets those fuels to where they need to be.
Excellent answer.
Great. We've got a number of questions about your work in different levels of government. What have you found most rewarding in municipal, federal, military settings? What are some of the challenges you found in transitioning between those different levels of government? And those are from Matthew Groff, Joshua Anker, both students in our executive and full-time program, a number of others.
Well, there's been a lot of whiplash in my career, going from being mayor to lieutenant to presidential candidate to secretary. And certainly each level of government has different levels of forms of reward. I still think there's nothing like local government. And I just said this to the National League of Cities the other day. In fact, in many ways, I measure our success federally by whether we're making it easier for local government to get their job done. And I say that because in local government, you are directly accountable for results. And while you may have strong moral or political values, your ideology doesn't generally tell you what to do about the very specific problems that you confront. Partisanship doesn't solve your questions for you. You have to agonize in ways that nobody's going to tell you what to do, and you can't always fall back on some received wisdom. You just have to solve the problem. You have to work with very different kinds of people to get the problem solved. But when you get it solved, when you get a project done, you see it, you feel it, you know the guts of it. That's what I miss about other levels of government. It's certainly what I missed when I got deployed. And I went from being a mayor commanding a small bureaucracy and maneuvering it around to try to get things done, to being a very junior officer in the world's biggest bureaucracy, which is the US Department of Defense. And in that case, I found I spent less time navigating the world with my toolkit and more time navigating my own organization. Figuring out who does what is like half of what you spend your time on. And then within that, the art of getting things done. And just to take what sounds like a small and trivial example, but a big part of my responsibility, as I mentioned, had to do with driving. I had to get other members of my unit or my commander or my equipment safely from point A to point B, because I happened to be one of the few members of my unit who was qualified on a rifle, and there was a requirement that you had to have at least 2 long guns in a vehicle when it went outside the wire. So more than 100 times I went outside the wire to just get something around the city of Kabul or up between Kabul and Bagram. Even though this was probably the most important responsibility I had, what I did not have was a vehicle. So anytime I wanted to meet my mission, I had to borrow a vehicle from somebody. And there was nothing on the org chart, nothing in the chain of command, nothing in the instructions that I received from headquarters that specified whose vehicles I would get to drive. It turned out that the way to get a vehicle was to get on the good side of this guy named Marlin. I, to this day, don't know what exactly Marlin did. I just knew that he had the keys to the Land Cruisers. And I also knew that if I dealt him in on the chocolate chip cookie bars that came in the care packages that came from South Bend, he might look a little more kindly on my pleading with him to allow me to use a vehicle out of the motor pool to go get something done. And it was a real education in the difference between how the book says something gets done and how things get done among human beings. Ironically, because the machinery of the military is so big and so bureaucratic, the human relationships matter more than ever. In some ways, I have a similar experience here at the federal level. The difference here is that when you're atop a very large organization, less and less information gets to you. When you were a mayor, there was no risk of you being out of touch with what's going on the ground, because if you attempt to buy groceries, somebody will tell you. You cannot hide, even if you wanted to, from the realities of people going about their lives and how your decisions made those daily routines better or worse. Here, it's a little bit different. Although I try to cut through that, whether it's talking to friends and family, seeing what people have to say when they come up to me on the street or on the subway, or just seeking different sources of information. But there's a whole machinery through which information gets filtered. And you have to figure out ways to pick up the phone or get on the road. I spend a lot of time just trying to get out from behind this desk. And we take about a trip a week to better understand how these things are landed. But the more senior you become, the more protected you become from some of the information you in fact most need in order to make decisions. That's been the greatest challenge of this role. The greatest reward of it, of course, is the scale of impact. My predecessor, or not my former public works director back when I was mayor, told me when I came out here to get this job that I would become like the trim rudder on a super tanker. And that is how it feels. I'm a very small piece of a huge machine. And if I move just a little this way or that way, and if I wait long enough, I can see an entire apparatus begin to move in that same direction. Making sure it's the right direction and being able to actually get it to actually move is often the greatest challenge for a senior leader in a federal agency.
That's a great answer. I just want to jump in and say, when I was in an administration in a much more junior role, I felt like I was a tugboat and I could nudge. So I was the tug.
Right.
Anyway, I also want to say EQ is emotional quotient is such an undervalued gift, and you've got it in abundance. And with the high IQ, it's powerful, and we see it in your successes. So anyway, thank you. Back to Mindy.
Thank you so much. And fascinating. We have students who are trying to work in all levels of government. So that was wonderful to hear. Along similar line to what Elizabeth was just saying, a number of folks commented that you are a fantastic extemporaneous communicator, particularly in describing and explaining complex policy issues. One question was, are you naturally gifted or did you cultivate that skill? How does one go about cultivating that? And then how do you think about best practices in communicating about complicated policies with the public? How can we get better at that? And these questions are from a combination of Brandon Parrish, Aaron McClendon, Chris Johnson, and Elizabeth Burdett, ranging from alumni from 22 to students graduating in 25.
Well, thanks for the flattering premise of the question. To the extent I'm good at that, I would say, but first of all, don't let anybody tell you an English major doesn't have practical utility. I studied history and literature, and I lean on that training all the time. Not least because you understand the importance of very, very subtle differences in language, and you learn to understand the importance of style. And believe it or not, even the text of a regulation has a certain style to it. Hilary Mantel, one of my favorite authors, in her Wolf Hall trilogy, which is about the life of one of the main advisors to Henry VIII, has this comment somewhere in there about how when you're writing laws, you're using words to their maximum effect, like spells, and like laws, or like spells, she writes, laws only work if people actually believe in them. And I think about that as a non-lawyer who doesn't, strictly speaking, write laws, but generates policies and regulations and earns my paycheck often by communicating what we're doing to the media, the Congress, or the public. I know that every word affects not just how we're perceived, but what actually happens out there. Sometimes a couple of words in a memo have become the subject of very hot questioning in a Senate committee because of who those words upset. And sometimes there's a contest over what those words even mean. And sometimes what those words come to mean and the power they have is not even the same as what was in the minds of the people who wrote them. Something else, by the way, that you learn in literature, but that applies in regulatory and legislative contexts. So look, part of what I do is I talk for a living. I do three things. I've got on a sticky note here to remind me on my little screen here. I prioritize, I communicate, and I motivate. I figured out that's what a secretary does all day, or should be. And that communicate part, internally and externally, is a huge part of the job.
Wow, I think we should all have Post-it notes.
I was going to say, I'm going to write myself a Post-it note. I like that. Prioritize, communicate, and motivate. Along the same lines, a few questions from some folks about when you're working in diverse teams, especially in the political world with different ideologies, how do you approach problem solving? Or, in our polarized society or polarized political landscape, how can you motivate people to work toward common goals? And that's from one of our prospective students, your hopeful future students, Taha Rashid, as well as a few others.
Well, that's a great question. And the first thing I would say is the importance of leaning into the diversity of opinions, especially if you're a decision maker in government. A decision should only reach you if there are very good reasons not to do each one of the courses of action you're deciding between. Okay. And you've got to figure out which combination of pros and cons to accept. And you have to accept in all humility the fact that you will make mistakes and get some of these decisions wrong. But in the quest to try to have more of them be right than be wrong, at a minimum, you need to make sure you've heard all of the reasons to do something or to do something different. And so you not only need to have a diverse set of people at the table, they need to be empowered to speak. And they need to know that when they do, they'll be taken seriously. And we even here talk about an obligation to dissent. So if you don't agree with something, if you think a deliberation is drifting into groupthink, you should speak up and say why. Now, the other side of the coin is to recognize that when a decision is made, a team needs to come together and move forward. And something else I learned, even as a lieutenant, was the importance and the value of making my recommendation as transparently as I could to my commander on what to do. And whether he did what I said I thought would be the best idea, or whether he did the opposite, the next move was to go out there and get it done. And while a federal agency doesn't work like a military chain of command, there is that same spirit of being completely transparent about our disagreements when we're deciding what to do next. but then coming together and being aligned around how to make that course of action successful once the course of action has been chosen. You also, of course, that's not just an internal question, it's an external question. How do you make sure diverse voices are included in decision-making, including voices that don't routinely have access to the halls of government? That's what our notice and comment rulemaking system in all of its procedural glory is meant to achieve. And that can add time to a process. But I think it can also save time in a process if making sure all voices are heard early on means that you don't have to slam on the brakes at the 11th hour because some source of resistance or some flaw in the approach was not contemplated. So I'm a big believer in making sure that everybody is heard, even if you don't agree, they'll be better able to buy into the decision if they've been heard. And then there's the humility of knowing that you maybe don't have it right, and that your decision will be better once you hear a good, strong argument from somebody who's leaning a different way than you are. I have to admit that's happened many, many times when I thought I was on the right track. I was advised otherwise, and that turned out to be true.
Wow, and diversity is strength. Yeah.
Thank you. I know we're getting close to time. I'm going to see if I can squeeze in 2 more question combos. So a couple questions around how you prepare for your media engagements, your legendary Fox News interviews, and how you manage personal attacks or questions that come up that might be critical of you personally or policies. Any advice that you would have for folks? We have a lot of aspiring public leaders on this call in preparing and also sort of steeling yourself when that happens.
Yeah, so on preparing, I think everybody does their homework differently. One of the challenges for me in this role is we do so many things across so many fields that I can't always have technical mastery of the topic I'm discussing. I just have to learn the things that are most important for the public to understand. And so if I'm discussing an individual project, sometimes there might only be a few minutes to study up on it. And then communicate it and then move on to another project. So it's really about efficiency and time and making sure you understand. I mean, a good way to do it is to take note of the questions being asked because you can also get in your head about knowing every detail of a project and completely lose touch with the listener, who's probably a layperson who you're trying to explain it to. So it's really important to spend more time thinking about what people need to know than how much you know. And frankly, don't take too much on board, which is a weird thing to say, especially as a curious person, which I am, but there's just not enough room up here to even get all the facts about some project before some other important piece of knowledge falls off the cliff of my addled brain. So, there's also an economy of words in how I ask to be briefed, not because I'm not interested, but because I need to know the things I actually need to know. Imagine this thought experiment. If you need to remember, you have 30 minutes to go, 30 seconds to go on television. And all you need to tell everybody is that there's a blue circle, a green triangle, and a red square. And if somebody briefing you feels the need to say, by the way, I also noticed a purple parallelogram, your chances of successfully delivering that message just went down. So you got to really be disciplined about what you're gonna say.
We got to clone you. Can we clone you?
I wouldn't recommend that. But what was the other part? Sorry, oh, the attacks. Yeah, that's the worst. That's the worst part of this, right? Is the negativity. And you probably shouldn't be going into public life if you're not ready to absorb some amount of negativity. And it will hurt most when it's coming from your friends, right? If somebody on the other side of the aisle or somebody who hates everything you stand for doesn't like you and says so, like, okay, that's unpleasant, but it's probably not going to get to you or bother you the way somebody you think of as your ally will if they think that you have turned on them or they don't believe you made the right decision. And so many of the tough decisions that wind up on people's desks in government are ones where you have to choose. It's not choosing between some clear right answer and some clear wrong answer. It's choosing between something you believe in and something else you believe in. And it turns out you can't get this done without compromising that. That's what makes it so hard. That's why it's on your desk. That's why the decision is being made by a person and not a formula. Those are hard to carry and the critiques are hard to take, but taking them seriously is good for you. Taking the hate seriously is not, but taking a critique from somebody whose opinion you respect is good for you. Because as you absorb that, although it's painful, you will either have a more nuanced understanding of your own opinion or decision, maybe even reconsider it. Or in turning that over in your mind as it follows you home and follows you as you're tossing and turning at night and follows you into the shower, you will work out why you actually believe more than ever that you did do the right thing and that your friend who you respect was mistaken to criticize you. And either way, you're better off knowing. So it's important, I think, to value that as part of the process and to separate that from the bad faith negativity and increasingly just well-funded misinformation that flies around online. That's not your problem. It's your problem tactically, but it's not your problem morally. Your problem morally is what to do when the critics just might be right and how you handle that.
Great answer. Mindy, do we have a quick one and then back to me or no?
I'll give you the question and you can probably fold it into yours. We have a lot of folks asking what's next for you, what might be coming next, and then what words of advice do you have for aspiring public leaders? And Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to add to that or frame it or.
Yeah, I'd just say, my last question, because people love to hear this, is what sort of 2 or 3 things would you have liked to have told your 25-year-old self? And then please leave us with some hope for the future of the country. That's my last question.
Okay. Well, what's next for me is lunch, which I'm looking forward to with a stakeholder that I think I can learn a thing or two from. But I don't mean to be flip. I don't know what will be next in my career. I know that every job I've had, it's paid off to have the mentality that the most important thing for the future is to do a good job at the job at hand. And I really try to be disciplined about that, especially when it's a job as demanding as this one. I wish my 25, well, one thing that by the time I was 27, I had figured out, but probably not when I was 25, was just how much value and power there is at the local level. Because I came out of undergrad and grad school really thinking that all of the action was in national and maybe international politics and policy. And never would have imagined the challenge, the adventure, the discovery, the complexity that was waiting for me in situations unfolding less than a mile from my own house until I became steeped in the life of my own community. So that's something I wish I would have understood differently. And then as somebody who at the age of 25 was still wondering whether the fact that I was gay would end my career if and when I said it out loud. It would have been nice to know that I actually did not have to choose between things I cared about, like public service and military service, and things I care about even more, like falling in love and starting a family. I didn't even get going on that until I was in my 30s. And maybe that all worked out for the best, because I certainly wouldn't have it any other way in terms of the amazing son and daughter and husband that I have at home. And maybe it even helped me be a good mayor, that I had nothing else going on in my life for my but at the end of the day, I couldn't do what I do now without a family. And I just wish I knew that was all going to be okay. And maybe that's part of how I can answer that last question, Elizabeth, about hope. It wasn't that long ago that I joined a military whose policy was to fire me for who I was. And it wasn't that long ago that I ran for public office in Indiana, knowing, not suspecting, but knowing that the idea of doing so as an out gay man would have been not just risky, but preposterous. And just a few years after that, I'm talking to you from my office as Senate confirmed secretary in the cabinet of the President of the United States. That gives me some hope. So does the infrastructure work we're doing around the country. Good work, good projects that need to be done. We got done through a bipartisan bill that passed in one of the most polarized Washingtons since the civil rights era or then some. And the other thing that gives me hope is becoming a parent and not having the luxury of being anything but hopeful, because too much depends for them on us figuring this stuff out. Which is why the students in particular who are part of this program, no pressure, but are going to be needed so that I can put my feet up one day and know everything's going to be just fine for my kids. But for now, it's your turn and our turn
Mhm.
Anybody who's in public policy, anybody who's in a position of responsibility, and anybody who is studying at an advanced level the pulleys and levers of government while our democracy comes under the
Mhm.
toughest pressures that it's seen in decades, or even by some measures since the Civil War, to figure this out, because
Mhm.
everyday life depends on it. And everyday
Mhm.
life, in the end, is what all politics and policy
Mhm.
is about.
Mhm. Beautiful answer. Particularly because of the combination of focus, which really brings balance, I think you might say. And although we can't be you, we can certainly aspire to be part of that. I want to thank you beyond words from all of us for this incredibly inspiring hour, and especially for your immense public service and your broad shoulders, carrying a lot of water for us so effectively. And lastly, I want to say, please let us know when we can deliver Pennsylvania for you for whatever it is that you do next. Thank you, Pete. I should say thank you, Secretary.
I'll go by Pete any day, and thanks for having me. It's a real honor.
Great. Take care.
Thank you so much.